Hi, good afternoon. It's great to be with you this afternoon. My name is Nathan Gonzales, and I'm here at a very special place called the Lincoln Memorial Shrine. Some of you might have been here before, but it is a museum, which is a place where you get to learn about things from the past. Some museums have art, some museums have things like dinosaur bones. We have things related to history. And at this museum, we specifically focus on Abraham Lincoln, who was a president for the United States, his family, and the Civil War that happened in the mid-19th century, which is more than 150 years ago, and all of the things that surrounded that. So this afternoon, I'm going to show you some really special things that are in the collection where you'll get to look up close and see what those are like and maybe learn a little bit about history and get a real kind of connection to these things from the past. The first thing I'd like to share with you this afternoon is a little bit of the story about how this museum even got to Redlands. And it's been here since 1932, which is a very long time. It's 88 years ago, which is probably older than your grandparents or your great-grandparents. It's a long time ago. But it all started because of one family, and they lived here in the 1920s and the 1930s, and the 1940s, actually. And they were called the Watchorns. So Robert Watchorn was actually born in England in 1858, which is a very, very long time ago. But he was in a very poor family. And in central England, in a little tiny town called Alfreton, you can look it up on your favorite map app. This little tiny town at that period of time was known for coal mining. Now it might be that the only time you've ever heard about coal is if you were looking forward to Christmas and someone may have suggested that if you weren't nice, you would get coal in your stocking. But in the 19th century, the 1800s, coal was used to burn to create heat. So if you didn't have, like we have today, central heating and air, you probably had some kind of a stove or a small fireplace, and instead of burning wood, you would burn something like coal. It's this little black in color, charcoal in color, material that is mined out of the earth. So people dig these big tunnels, and they use all kinds of tools to extract, to take this stuff out of the ground that they can then distribute, and people burned it in their homes to create heat, or big industry used it to create steam power, because that's what you would use to boil the water to make a steam engine burn. You might have seen trains from the very olden days that had big billowing black smoke that comes out of the stack at the front of the locomotive. In those early days they used wood, but then they used coal for a very long period of time before shifting to other things that they could burn like oil. So this had to come from somewhere, and someone had to do that work. And as you might imagine, if you have to go way underground, sometimes those tunnels are very small, and grown men might not fit so well in these small tunnels. And if you were a poorer family and you needed to create income for your family and you were young and small, then you might get hired to work in one of these coal mines because you could fit into these little tunnels. So as a very, very young boy, Robert Watchorn started working in these coal mines in central England. And it was a filthy, dirty, difficult job. But a lot of kids were employed this way. So I brought out a picture just to give you an idea. These kids might be your age, and they had to go down into these mines every day. They didn't have the same kind of safety equipment that we have today. They didn't have the same kind of lighting that we have today. It was a very dangerous job, and it was very dirty. A lot of people ended up dying because of lung issues from inhaling coal dust for a long career. So it's a very nasty business, but if you're trying to help feed your family, you have to do what you have to do. So that's what Robert Watchorn was doing as a child. But there came a point where he decided that he wanted something better for himself and something better for his family. And like so many people have in the more than 200-year history of our country, he decided that he was going to find his way to the United States to make a better life for himself. So he emigrated to the United States. And he first landed, well, he came through the port of New York, like so many people from Europe did. But then he ended up in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, he started working in the same industry because it was really all he knew, and that was mining. So Pennsylvania had huge coal mines in this part of the 1800s, and that's where he went to work. Over the course of his short career in coal in Pennsylvania, he became more active in things like politics and in government work. He started working then for the state of Pennsylvania with mine safety issues, realizing that that was important. Then he eventually became a naturalized citizen of the United States. He joined the United States Immigration Service, which is the division of the federal government that helps to manage people coming in and out of the country. And he rose through those ranks. He eventually became a commissioner of immigration at Montreal, the border there. So he was in charge of the whole operation there. And then he was appointed in 1905 by President Teddy Roosevelt to be the Commissioner of Immigration at Ellis Island, which is in New York Harbor. And that's where hundreds of thousands of people, maybe probably more, many thousands of people who came to the United States from Europe came through Ellis Island. And so he was in charge of that from 1905 until 1909. And then after he left that, he decided to go into a totally different career path. He became the treasurer for the Union Oil Company. And then after he left the Union Oil Company, he started his own oil company and managed to strike it rich in Oklahoma with the Watchorn Oil and Gas Company. So here's Watchorn, who was born poor, worked very hard in coal mines, but managed to help educate himself, and then ended up to be a very prominent person because of what he was able to accomplish. And what he saw in himself is what many see as the American dream, which is the ability to come from meager circumstance, maybe poor or have other kinds of disadvantages, and then be able to rise up and do very well. So he saw that really as a promise of America, and he saw that also in Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, which is a very, very long time ago, more than 200 years ago, in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky on a farm. And he educated himself, and he became a lawyer, and he became president of the United States. So Watchorn saw in Lincoln's story his own story, albeit in a slightly different form, and the story that many Americans strive for. So that's how the interest from Robert Watchorn got in Lincoln. He also shared the interest with Lincoln with his son Ewart. So here's a picture of the Watchorn family. Robert had married his wife Alma. She was from the United States, so they met here, and they had this little boy. I know it might be hard to tell because the clothing styles were different in the mid-1890s from what we know today. But in 1895, Alma gave birth to Ewart. His full name is actually Emery Ewart Watchorn. But sometimes people go by their middle names. You might go by your middle name instead of a first name. When I was a kid, my name is Nathan Daniel. My parents decided that for a baby, Nathan didn't sound like a very childlike name. So they called me Danny until I was in kindergarten, and then I decided that I was too old to be Danny and I would be Nathan. So Ewart is similar to that. He always went by E. Ewart Watchorn. So now you know a little something about Ewart. So Robert and Ewart had this shared interest in Abraham Lincoln. Now fast forward a little bit, Ewart went to Hollywood High School, and then during the First World War, the United States entered that war in 1917, and then it was over at the end of 1918. But Ewart wanted to be a pilot, so he actually went to Italy to fly with the Italian Air Force. And he actually knew a guy who you might one day hear his name, named Fiorello LaGuardia. LaGuardia became mayor of New York at one point and was a very, very famous, influential person. But he got his first job working as an Italian interpreter for Robert Watchorn at Ellis Island. So they were very close with the family. So Ewart went to Italy to fly with the Italians over the Alps. But while he was there, his health became very compromised. They were flying in these airplanes that didn't have roofs. And when you're going over very high altitudes and mountains, it can get really cold. So he had major health problems, and eventually, unfortunately, he succumbed to what was called septicemia at the time, which is like a blood poisoning. But because his health was compromised, he really wasn't able to overcome this, and he died when he was only 25 years old. And as you might imagine, something like that really devastated Robert and Alma Watchorn, and they started looking around for ways to honor Ewart's memory. One of the things that they did was they attended a Methodist church in Los Angeles, and so they gave chimes to that church in his memory. Robert and Alma would go back to Robert's hometown in England and do good things there with the income that he had garnered through the oil industry, and build playing fields for kids so that children would have great benefit of the outdoors in that part of England, and they were named in honor of Ewart Watchorn. And the Watchorns had started moving to spend winters in Redlands in the 1920s, and they owned a house on Highland Avenue, which is at Highland Avenue and Alvarado Street. If you happen to be around town, it's the northwest corner. So if the park's to your back and you're at the intersection, it's the house on the left. Right across basically from the driveway to go up Prospect Drive to Kimberly Crest. So that was the Watchorns' house, and that's where Robert and Alma lived when they were here. So it was fitting then that they would start to think about ways they could honor Ewart's memory here in Redlands. And Robert had been collecting things related to Lincoln, believing that it was something really worthy of study for everyone. And he talked then to the library board. They considered putting a Lincoln Library wing onto Smiley Library. But then they decided maybe this was too special to be a wing on the library and that it needed its own place. And that's how the Lincoln Shrine was born. So the Lincoln Memorial Shrine was created as a place to come to learn about Lincoln, to contemplate the lessons that Lincoln helps teach us, to understand things about the challenges of the American Civil War. And that's how it all started. One of the things I'd like to share with you today is about the Lincoln family. Abraham and Mary Lincoln had 4 children, so I'm going to share some things about them with you this afternoon. The oldest child, their firstborn, was named Robert Todd Lincoln, and his middle name, Todd, is actually Mrs. Lincoln's maiden name. So the last name that she had before she married Abraham Lincoln. So we refer to her as Mary Todd Lincoln. She actually had a second name before her maiden name became her middle name, but when we think of Mary Todd Lincoln today, that's why. So Robert Todd Lincoln includes the Todd from Mary Todd and her family. Then they had another son named Edward Baker Lincoln, and it's kind of interesting, we don't really think about it too much today, but in the 19th century, it was really common for people to name their children after either close friends or maybe important figures in time. So there are a whole lot of people named things like George Washington something, or Thomas Jefferson something. In this case, Edward Baker Lincoln is named for a very close friend of Abraham Lincoln's, who was Edward Baker, right? So that's how Edward Baker Lincoln was named. Very sadly, Eddie, as they called him, died before he was 4 years old. So that was a major tragedy for the Lincoln family. Then they had another son named William Wallace Lincoln. Named for William Wallace, I would imagine, right? And after that, they had Thomas Lincoln III, which is kind of funny. Thomas was Abraham Lincoln's father's first name, and he was Thomas Lincoln II. So when the Lincolns had their fourth child, they named it for Abraham Lincoln's father, and because he was the second, they made this one the third. So there's a jump there, but Thomas Lincoln III. His nickname was Tad, and the reason that they called him Tad was because Abraham said that he had a big head and wiggled around like a tadpole as a baby. So the nickname stuck, and that's how most people think of little Thomas Lincoln today. By the time that the Lincolns got to the White House, which he was elected president in the 1860 election and was inaugurated in March of 1861, the boys were still young. Robert Todd Lincoln was going to go to Harvard for university, and the younger two boys then lived in the White House with Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln. In 1862, they had another tragedy, though, and that is when little William Wallace Lincoln, died. So the first thing I want to show you today, and I'm going to put some gloves on, because when you're in a museum setting like this and you're working with historical materials, our job is to make sure that these things exist for as long as we possibly can. And people, me, everybody, we have little oils that our body produces, and they end up on our fingers. And if I touch something, then whatever's on my fingers gets onto whatever I'm touching, and it could be there forever. And forever is a very, very long time. So I would prefer that 200 years from now, someone doesn't come and look at my fingerprint and say, that Nathan, he didn't wear gloves, and now we still have evidence that he was here. So I'm going to put these white gloves on, and they're made out of cotton. So the gloves, in this case, are to protect the items that we have at the museum. So this is really cool. Here is a picture of Willie Lincoln. You can see there. And here is a lock of Willie Lincoln's hair. So even though he died in 1862, this lock of hair was kept in a little case, and now for us we have it here paired with a picture of him. So this is actually a real connection to this son of Abraham Lincoln. One of the really neat things about being able to go to museums, and hopefully soon you'll have the opportunity to come down to the Lincoln Shrine where you can see these things yourself. But different than seeing a digital representation, so a picture on your computer, when you see the real thing, you know that you're looking in life at part of Willie Lincoln. And you can do that with many things in museums. It's a different experience when you can actually see, a letter that was written by Abraham Lincoln, the actual thing, So it's really neat. So here is William Wallace Lincoln's hair. You think that's cool? I think that's cool. Tad and Robert Todd both survived through the Civil War, and Robert Todd Lincoln actually became a very important figure. He served in the cabinet as Secretary of War for Presidents Garfield and President Arthur. He was president of the Pullman Palace Car Company. They made railroad cars, the Pullman Company. And he did a lot of other things too. Tad, unfortunately, when he was 18, had a very short illness, and he too died. As you might imagine, Mary Lincoln's life was filled with tragedy. She lost 3 of her 4 children. She witnessed the murder of her husband, Abraham, who was murdered in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. So things were very tragic for her, and it was a challenging time. So one of the neat things that we have to help illustrate that time is this little bit of black lace. In the 19th century, it was custom for people who were experiencing loss while they were grieving to wear the color black. And with so much grief in her life, Mary Lincoln wore quite a bit of black. So this actual piece of lace was part of one of her dresses. So here's another example where you have someone from the past and you can see something that they touched at some point in their life, and it also helps us illustrate the tragedy of life in the 19th century, and specifically for the Lincoln family. And like what you saw from Willie Lincoln, here is a picture of Mary Todd Lincoln, and you can see a lock of her hair. Now, all of the pictures from this period of history are in what they call black and white. There's no color. It's all a range from white through all the grays to the darkest color, which is black. So you don't really know what someone's hair color might have been. You might be able to guess from the picture. But here you can see exactly what her hair color was, because this is her hair. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I'm on a hair kick, but this is very cool too. So, there's not a lot of this running around, but I have to take my glasses off because I have to be able to see close up. You may experience that one day too. Here, in this little box, you can see these are actually strands of Abraham Lincoln's hair. So you can see exactly what his hair color was too. That's pretty cool, right? So you can see firsthand Willie Lincoln, firsthand Mary Todd Lincoln, and now here is Abraham Lincoln. But what's also neat is we have a couple other things that help you understand better Abraham Lincoln. So I'm going to share this with you because I think this is really neat. This is called a life mask. In 1860, before Abraham Lincoln was even nominated to the presidency, there was a sculptor in Chicago who wanted to be able to create a likeness of Lincoln. But as you might imagine, it takes a long time to create a sculpture, which is a three-dimensional piece of art. So in order for Lincoln not have to sit through many hours of sittings for the artist, they decided to create a mold of his face, and then the artist, whose name was Volk, would be able to just look at the plaster cast of his face, and Lincoln could go on and do his thing. So he sat in the studio, and I think it was probably a relatively unpleasant experience. They had to take straws, like straws you might drink soda or water or milk with. They put the straws up his nose, and they put little things over his eyes, and then they covered his whole face with plaster. You might have used plaster of Paris before if you were creating a craft project or something like that. And once that plaster hardened, which took a little bit of time, then they could peel it off. But the straws were so that he could breathe while all of this plaster was covering his face. So finally, after the plaster set up, they could peel it off. It probably pulled out some of his eyebrows or other hairs like that. But what you got then was the ability to make Lincoln's actual face with another piece of plaster. So when you come to the Lincoln Shrine and you see this on exhibit, you know exactly what Abraham Lincoln looked like, because this is done, pretty much directly from his own face. So you can see him. You can see his dimensions. Part of the interesting and important work that we do is when you think of Abraham Lincoln, you might think of the penny or the $5 bill or a statue in Washington, D.C. or something But it's really important to know that these were real people who had real feelings, who had real experiences, both good and bad, but they're just regular people like we are. So this can help you see that, yes, he's not just a big statue at a memorial, but he was a real breathing person. One of the other things that Volk did, though, was cast his hands. So here is a copy of one of those castings of Abraham Lincoln's. This is his right hand. And you see there's a little piece of what actually was probably a broom handle that he's holding onto. And the reason that the artist wanted him to be holding something, because if you look at your own hand, and I'll demonstrate for you here, but you can try it too. So if you just make a fist, it looks like one, but if you're forced to grip on something, it brings out, the veins and the musculature that's in your hand, and you can see a lot more detail than if it was just sitting there. So if you hold something around, so try that. If you grab a broom handle or a couple of fingers like I'm doing, and grip that really tightly, and then you can see all the different bits that are underneath your skin making up your hand. So that's why he's holding the broom handle, so that you can see all of the different detail that were in his hand. Here's a similar example of his left hand. So when you look at this, you can see, well, was his hand bigger than mine? Was it smaller than mine? How did it look? Abraham Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall. Just a very tall guy. I'm only 5'10", so he's like there. I'm probably shrinking too, so I'm maybe shorter than 5'10" by now. But 6'4", it's really tall. But now you can look at his hands and you can get a better sense of what he looked like. Right? So that's pretty cool, right? Well, we also have, you might never have heard of a thing called a cufflink. But a cufflink is a piece of, I guess it's a kind of jewelry almost. Here we have this is called a barrel cuff shirt. And these have buttons, so you might have a shirt like this at home. But at this period of time, and actually you can still buy them today, the way that the cuff was made is they didn't use a button like this. It was longer and it folded over, and then instead of folding over itself, it put the two ends together like this. And then there were two holes, one on each side, and you would put a cuff link through it, and that's what would hold your shirt cuff closed. So these are cuff links that Abraham Lincoln used to keep his shirt cuffs closed. That's pretty neat, right? That these little bits of jewelry were actually worn by Abraham Lincoln. And then the last thing I want to share with you over here is things in the 1860s were not as different as they are today. So we have a letter here. And the letter is written by Mary Todd Lincoln, and it's from 1863. And he writes to a gentleman named Mr. Harrington, who was working for them at the White House. And he says, "We would like to have the services of Charles from today at 2 p.m. until tomorrow at 11 a.m. Very respectfully, Mrs. Lincoln." What they're asking for is for Charles to be a babysitter for Tad, because Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln were planning to be overnight at an event in Baltimore. So even in the 1860s, sometimes the Lincolns needed a babysitter. So it ended up that Mrs. Lincoln didn't go to Baltimore, but Abraham Lincoln did, and they didn't need the babysitter after all. But just goes to show how little sometimes things have changed. There's a really great story that we have here at the museum about a young man who was 18 years old, and he decided to join the U.S. Army to serve during the Civil War. And there are people in the Army that do all kinds of different things. And one of the important roles, actually, especially for marching, was to have a drummer to help keep cadence as you marched along. Drummers did a lot of things too, but this guy who owned this drum, was named Benjamin Hilliker, and he was originally from New York, but then his family moved when he was young, and he joined the Army when they lived in Ohio. And he served in the Army from the time that he joined until something very tragic for him happened, which was in 1863, his unit was in Mississippi because there was a big siege, which is where you kind of surround a city so that things can't get in and out of them, and eventually the hope is, if you're the sieger, that the place that is under siege gives up and then you win, right? So the city of Vicksburg was on the Mississippi River, and it was under siege under the command of General Grant, who later would be President of the United States. But Grant is a pretty well-known person in Civil War military history. So Hilliker was there around the Battle of Vicksburg, the siege of Vicksburg. And one day there was a skirmish, and he put his drum down and picked up a rifle to move out as part of this skirmish, and he ended up getting shot in the head, which was a pretty nasty part of war, is, getting wounded or getting killed. But it didn't kill him. It went through his head, ended up disfiguring him, but he kept on. And so after the war was over, he joined a group called the Grand Army of the Republic, which was made of U.S. military veterans of the Civil War. And in the 1890s, he was awarded the Medal of Honor by the U.S. Congress, which is pretty exciting. He had already moved to Los Angeles, so he lived in the greater Southern California area, and his family, many years later, gave us his drum from his time serving with the Grand Army of the Republic and his Medal of Honor. So there aren't that many Medal of Honor recipients in the entire history since it was created during the Civil War, but he was one of them. And what's really neat about this drum is that there's a little peephole in the side, and if you look all the way through on the other side, there is a little picture of 18-year-old Benjamin Hilliker holding his drum. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon here with us at the Lincoln Memorial Shrine. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I'd really like to thank Mansion Memories for the opportunity to share all of this with you. And I hope that you and your family are keeping well and safe, that you're able to continue learning, even though your schools may be closed. And that once the Lincoln Museum is able to reopen again safely, I hope you and your family will have the opportunity to come down and you can see all of these things with your very own eyes, and come back maybe many times over the next several years, because we have new exhibits all the time. So there's always something interesting to see and learn while you're here. While you're at home, you can visit us at www.lincolnshrine.org and see all kinds of online exhibits. Thanks very much, and I hope you have a magical day.